Hello, my name is Wayne Barnum, and I will be giving this topic lecture on the January Public Forum topic Resolve the African Union should grant diplomatic recognition to the Republic of Somaliland as an independent state. This will mostly cover a number of different ideas that we're going to discuss, likely for the remainder of the year. There's a good viability that this will be our state topic, and so it's important that we cover a lot of this. For those of you who do know me, this will mostly be a discussion on how to think with this resolution and how to identify where things should be going. This is a pretty unique resolution compared to what we've seen on the circuit in a long time. We haven't really done a debate on a non-US actor, I think, in my entire career. This will be a pretty interesting one. For those of you who do know me, I've been doing competitive speech and debate for 4 years now. I've done policy, Lincoln Douglas, and public forum debate, all three, and I am a national qualifier at extemp. I coach over at Mirror Lake Middle School and Greening Middle School, and I help with a number of different specific teams. What we're going to specifically talk about in this topic lecture is four parts: the resolution analysis, going over a lot of definitions, just like what the status quo looks like. Then we're going to delve into a bit of framing, just like a one slide part on like how we view this resolution and where to go with it. Then we're going to delve into some AF and neg ideas. I give you 12 contention ideas for all of them, which really fall into three major ideas. Ultimately, for the resolution analysis, we can look at it as it is a policy motion. There's a number of different ways to interpret motions. There's values motions, there's true-false motions, and then there's policy motions. Policy motions is where you identify an actor being able to commit to an action. So in this case, it's whether or not the AU should commit to the action of recognizing Somaliland. We see this in separate ways. We can interpret this being very similar to like the U.S. and with border surveillance in the September-October topic, in which the United States, as the actor, commits to an action of building surveillance on the border. This is somewhat of the same thing. Um, it looks very different from round to round. Your rounds aren't really going to change because we've only had policy motions this year so far, but it should be a lot more emphasis in the back half on like what type of resolution this is and how that changes the way that you debate. You want to get a number of definitions. Firstly, the AU, the African Union, which is an intergovernmental organization established in '02 with about four main attempts or four main goals. Firstly, to promote unity and solidarity of African states. Secondly, to spur economic development. Third, promoting international cooperation. And then a fourth one, which I didn't write because it'll become very apparent the longer that we're in this lecture, but increasing democratic opportunity, and pushing for more democratic and free choice for the African states. Ultimately, you can read this long member list. It's full of 55 nations of all the recognized African states, with a few exceptions. There are a number of observer states, such as Ukraine, and a number of countries in Eurasia. But ultimately, the three that you really need to know for this topic is just Egypt, Ethiopia, and Somalia. That becomes very apparent the longer we're here. Further, granting diplomatic recognition, the part of the like verb of this resolution, is the procedure by which a new state is formally accepted by other states as a member of the international community. So we can essentially look at it as in the same way from last month's resolution, in that the United States being able to recognize Taiwan as an independent state and being able to control what happens in its border and have an impact on the national and international stage is kind of the same thing, and that the AU is willing to recognize Somaliland as an independent actor and have influence on the national international stage. It's legitimizing the government by other nations. As an independent state is the subsection of that, which is to say that Somaliland, through recognition, the AU sees its government as legitimate, and that the government has a right to control what happens within its own borders. The main crux here is that Somalia doesn't believe that the Somaliland government is legitimate. And so as a result, they get to influence what happens within the Somaliland borders, because if they don't believe there's a legitimate government there, they can exert their influence upon it. So recognizing and giving the diplomatic recognition as an independent state is the AU saying, we believe your government is legitimate and we give you the authority to commit acts within your government, within your own government and nation, such as building roads, such as being able to pass legislation and being able to hold elections or or deem the government you choose to have. The two bigger nations that we're really going to talk about for most of this lecture is Somalia and Somaliland. both of which are the easternmost nations in Africa, Somalia being the easternmost. This is a really important geopolitical position. We'll get into that in a minute. But ultimately, the thing that you really need to know is that Somaliland broke away from Somalia in 1991 and has a pretty stable government. Somaliland is a pretty rare exception in terms of breakaway states, in that it has a working political system. It has a working government institution. It has its own police force and its own currency, which, if you've ever read Baudin's Mark of Sovereignty, is pretty unique and rare. Additionally, there are six states made up of Somalia and the different states within it. Um, Somaliland is just one or two of those states. We also recognize Puntland to be one of the states of Somalia. And so this is essentially an idea of a breakaway state forming its own nation and then succeeding at it. Somaliland, in almost most metrics, has been more successful than Somalia. The origin of these two is that originally there were two Somalilands. They came together in 1960 in an attempt to break away from British occupation and colonialism. That was the end of that was in the about the middle of the decolonization period, from about the 40s to the 80s, 90s. Um, and Somaliland, from that unity that created Somalia, decided to declare its independence in 1991, which has been fought for this since till about today. Negotiations are starting to pick up as we speak. But further, why does this topic really matter in the first place? There's a number of key reasons. Ultimately, we identified that this is one of the most important regions in the world. If you look at the map here, this right here is the Gate of Tears, which sees 1/3 of the world's cargo go through it, because you have the Suez Canal to the north and the Indian Ocean to the west, and so or east. You can make fun of me for it. So we see this as a pretty interesting spot because you have a pretty unstable region, but then you have Somaliland being a pretty stable actor, being able to kind of be this force of stability in a in a pretty chaotic area, which is something that we kind of need given how much port cargo goes through this and how much potential there is for disruption of economy if things go south. Additionally, Somaliland is a democratic breakaway. We don't see a lot of democratic breakaways, just like ever, when it comes to nations forming their own. We think that nations breaking away and then becoming democratic is honestly pretty rare. Most seizure groups end up forming dictatorships or authoritarian states as an attempt to consolidate power and be able to have a relationship between government and citizens. Somaliland is pretty unique among this, as when they broke away, after a few years, they had a fairly stable democracy, and till this day, their democracy is still working. We think that's a pretty notable exception and something that needs to be studied more. Additionally, again, Somaliland is really stable compared to its neighbors. The entire Horn of Africa is wrought with terror groups, Somalia having a bad history of the Somali pirates and other terror groups, and Ethiopia being engulfed in its civil war for over 20 years now, I think closer to 30. And so we see these actors around Somaliland being in pretty close to disarray and having governments that aren't necessarily in the interest of its people or working really well to be in those interests. And then you have Somaliland being a legitimate government in almost all metrics, who is working in that interest, who does have the ability to exert force within its own government for promotion of human rights and for stability compared to other actors. So we think that Somaliland, again, is a pretty clear exception in this region, and it's something that could become a cornerstone for future democratic understanding. Additionally, Trump, I believe on December 21st of, I guess, last year, called for Somaliland independence. And this is starting to upset a few actors, specifically Somalia, who obviously doesn't want to who lose states and have their breakaway states be seen as legitimate, but also China, who in every attempt to piss off the US is willing to back anyone, but also because China has economic interests in the region, because China is historically tied to Middle Eastern and African states in an attempt to help them grow and gain allyship against the West, but also just for self-prosperity. Um, China is set to be on the decline pretty soon. And so we think that their attempts to maximize allies, specifically with Somalia, is an attempt to help build partnership to be able to either delay that or be able to outlast. And we think that these two actors are going to have a lot of influence in this round. Additionally, Somaliland and Ethiopia, I'm going to move the map now. Somaliland and Ethiopia have a trade deal where Somaliland is giving Ethiopia access to the port seas because Ethiopia is a landlocked country. And in return, Ethiopia will give Somaliland some economic gains, but also in return, Ethiopia will recognize Somaliland as a legitimate government and will recognize them as a legitimate state. This is one of the first like actual routes Somaliland has had for that recognition. I think this is pretty unique and has a high chance for economic growth and stability in the region if this goes through. Additionally, the last major reason why this matters is the conflict might have potential to see resolution soon. Turkey's been negotiating conflict between Somaliland and Somalia in the past few months. I believe negotiations are set to return either this month or next month. So we can likely expect to see traction happen in terms of ending this conflict, likely once we stop debating this resolution. Additionally, when it comes to clan relations, Somaliland is much more interested in Somalia and preserving the ideas and groups that clans had when it came to pre-colonial territories and traditions. Um, bit less. The government's more interested in being a government and having borders. But the people and clans within Somalia have had more impact than in other places. In Somaliland, have had more impact than in other places, which is interesting considering that the borders that we're starting to see being shaped in this region are influenced by colonial pasts. The AAU is determined to uphold colonial borders in an attempt to minimize instability, in an attempt to maximize the availability for those countries to be able to have stable governments and then figure it out. Somaliland is in a somewhat of an issue given that, but we'll get to that in a second. Ultimately, zero countries recognize Somaliland. If you find sources that say they do, I would highly, highly question them. The only exception to this is Taiwan. We recognize that Taiwan, in most cases, sees Somaliland as legitimate. But because Taiwan is not seen as legitimate on the world stage, because it's not recognized as a country, we think that this has a very minimal impact on the world, but it does give a small route for future recognition and a route for there being some reasons to why China is upset. China can be upset of this resolution because of Somaliland's relation with Taiwan and a number of different influences that recognition has on the world. Additionally, Puntland, the pocket of orange right here, is a semi-autonomous region. It's like Somaliland, where it can be seen as independent, but it's much more heavily controlled by Somalia. We think that's in terms of having autonomy, Somaliland is the most free. Puntland is semi-free from Somalia, and then Somalia is owned by itself. Whoop-de-doo. We think that additionally, Puntland is having some issues with Somaliland because there's a large disputed area over territory and borders, and there has been conflict over it. The Los Andos conflict was a heavy Somaliland loss, which actually is one of the core reasons that their president and administration got voted out in their elections a month or two ago, I believe early December. And so the we can recognize just how much of an impact that the small region is having in terms of the stability of these countries, and the fact that there is a tough time figuring out what is the actual borders of Somaliland. Additionally, it becomes even harder when Somalia is committed to a one Somalia policy, closer to the same thing that China has with a one China policy, where the Taiwan will not exist, everything will be China. It's closer to the same thing. Somaliland will not exist, everything will be controlled by the Somalia government. Further, Ethiopia has control of a dam, somewhere in one of the regions, the Gurge Dam, which controls the source of the river of the Nile and is threatening to Egypt, who needs the Nile for both economic and financial growth and agricultural necessity. And ultimately, Ethiopia having control over that dam and then having relations with Somaliland makes the region be a bit tougher to work around. And so we see it as Ethiopia being an important actor, largely because it both has influence over Egypt, but also because of the potential to be the first state to recognize Somaliland. That covers a lot of bunch of background, and we've covered a lot of time here. But the main thing before we actually head into argument ideas is what we want to look at for framing. Um, Public forum in Alaska is like really 50-50 when it comes to framing and when it comes to like how we view rounds. I think I really want all of you, to emphasize the route for which we evaluate this round. Because we're not the United States evaluating this, we have to somewhat give up our Eurocentric understanding of the world and push towards what does the AU actually want and what does the continent as a whole actually want. It's hard to identify, but we can look at AU policy to eventually understand it and attempt to give some ability and way to evaluate this round. For actual framings, we can look at it as ideas of, do we prefer nations to have autonomy, or do we want to attempt to maximize sovereignty? That leads to somewhat of a large dichotomy where um, if we're willing to give up stability and let people have freedom, or if we can still give people freedom and not give up stability, or if we're willing to attempt to maximize the power that a government has in relation to the ability for people to have the right to self-determination, that is a pretty good way to evaluate around. Additionally, what stabilizes the region is honestly one of the better framings I've seen out of this so far. Just the general question of, can this region be stable at all, and is there a routes to do so, is a pretty good way to evaluate the round. Additionally, how do we end colonial influence in the region? This region and the continent as a whole is undoubtedly forever impacted by the colonial past that happened. And so we could reasonably interpret that there is a way to frame the round that helps relate it to how we as the AU move forward from the colonial past and into the future of the continent. Additionally, do we prefer to help Somaliland and hurt Somalia, or do we prefer to help Somalia and hurt Somaliland? There's a number of different contentions I'm going to give you that is one or the other. But it also doesn't have to just be. It can both be helping Somaliland and helping Somalia, or it could be hurting Somaliland and hurting Somalia. You'll understand that part in a minute. But ultimately, there's a number of different factors of where you can frame it, of who do we want to promote and how does that best fit with the ideals of the AU. That leads to the last two framing ideas. What routes of determination do we think the AU should pursue? Do we think that the AU is willing to give ideas and sovereigns the ability to have the right to determination, irregardless of colonial pasts and borders? Or do we think the AU's attempt to uphold colonial borders conflicts too much and that its true interests lie in stability? Identifying where the AU stands on this is probably the best bet. And additionally, what course of action for the AU is best for them to be able to be continued to be seen as a legitimate international organization? We think that that's an additional strong route to evaluate. There's four stakeholders for the rounds. They're all pretty broad, but it's good to know. Um, the biggest thing in here is that U.S. citizens are not the stakeholder. I think that we can finally have a resolution where the U.S. citizenry isn't really impacted unless you want to escalate to extinction or climate impacts, which I don't really see our lay circuit doing. The four stakeholders being the Somaliland government and citizens. So obviously, the nation we're talking about would be impacted. Somalia's government and citizen, as Somalia, most of the contentions you're going to see has indirect or direct effects on Somalia. Additionally, the African Union member states, all of them will be impacted by this, both by a precedent change and just how the organization as a whole moves forward with the recognition of Somalia or Somaliland, sorry. And then additionally, global superpowers like the US and China, they have pretty eager attempts to want to influence this region. And so recognition changes the balance of power for the US and for the United States and for China, and it kind of changes how we view both superpowers and how they attempt to influence the region. So that covers all the stakeholders. Um, what we're going to do now is we're going to cover the AF arguments in a number of different ways. I'm going to do it through three different lenses. All of them will have four different sub-arguments. But the main three that you're going to see on AF is justice, economy, and war. For justice, I believe the first one is decolonization. We can identify this to be that most justice arguments is that there has been a historic wrong or there's an attempt to achieve historical rights. And so by recognition, we can attempt to maximize people's ability to receive equitable freedoms and equitable determination and equitable paths towards the future that best helps and maximize quality of life and gives them the chance to have the best future. And we think that that is justice in terms of what historical traumas have occurred and both how we view governments to be legitimate, illegitimate, and how those are framed. So on the first one, decolonization. Ultimately, the original reason for secession, for the two Somalilands, was to end colonial rule. But we think that Somalia has been pretty bad at upholding that, and we think that Somalia being a bit authoritarian makes the citizens of Somaliland have a vie for independency. And we think that them leaving Somaliland is not about secession, but it's a restoration of decolonization. And it's an attempt for the people of Somaliland to escape the cycles of violence that colonization grows and nurtures. And we think that the Somaliland's government does not promote the democratic ideals that the Somaliland people want, and that they ultimately uphold a colonial framing of governments that is incompatible with the AU agenda. Yes, the AU wants to uphold colonial borders, but that does not necessarily mean that they want to uphold colonial practices. And so we think that the link is that recognition challenges these artificial boundaries of governance and or borders and restores the right of self-determination for the people of Somaliland and as the continent as a whole. We think that recognition sets a precedent change that nations are allowed to determine their own future in that is incompatible with what has happened in the past. So being an authoritarian previous state does not necessarily mean that you will always have to be that. We think that ultimately recognition gives the framework for other actors in the region to seek that self-determination through international law and through more stable routes and actions that lead to the best democratic societies or lead to societies that is best for these African nations and peoples free from the colonial past. It is, in a lot of essence, escaping from that colonial trauma and being able to progress under legal frameworks empowered by the African Union. Additionally, on democratic preservation, we're going to go top down, left, right. Democratic preservation. Somaliland's push for democracy is one of the most unique situations. We think that most attempts to become a new nation without foundation first is pretty hard. And so we think that like with examples like Taiwan had a strong original basis. They've been attempting to do so for so many years. And so them becoming a democracy was still a surprise, but made sense. Somaliland didn't necessarily have that same thing, and so we think that them becoming democracy is honestly unique. We think that recognition, the link is that recognition validates this push for democracy for countries, and it validates and rewards democratic governments that break away from authoritarian ones and attempts to promote democracy and maximizing human rights. And so we think that this ultimately inspires reform across Africa and the AU, which would lead to the AU questioning either colonial principles that it might hold, or it also just encourages other actors to be able to evaluate their democracies and lead to the best form of governments, both for themselves and for other actors, both in the AU and globally. Human rights. We think that Somaliland, relative to Somalia, who had numerous injustices against its peoples, is pretty good at maximizing human rights. There has been a number of recent violations by the old administration, but the old administration is gone and the new one is stepping in, and they need to. And the AU has a good chance to be able to recognize the new administration, which would likely give them a lot of legitimacy in attempting to maximize human rights. And be able to promote the availability of human rights in organizations in the country. We think that recognition, the link means that there's more cooperation with human rights organizations like the Red Cross and large international ones, like humanitarian funds. And we think this reduces risks of violation. Additionally, we think that recognition helps promote that right to self-determination for countries that help promote human rights. And we also think that it helps Somaliland be more accountable on the world stage to prevent any human rights violations, which actually helps set good frameworks for both the region and the world, as Somaliland then becomes this framework country that other nations look at their human rights in relation to, and both how they look at their government as well. And we think as a whole, there's enough literature to suggest that this would help maximize human rights in the region and allow for better collaboration. And we think that even if other nations don't directly change their policy and attempt to help with human rights, we think that Somaliland, being a stable country that has recognition, helps set up bases and jumping off points for other humanitarian organizations to help other actors like Ethiopia and Somalia with their ongoing conflicts, which helps saves lives and increases quality of life, and ultimately helps right the wrongs that both Somalia did against the Somaliland people, but also helps with the injustices and terrors that occur in both the region and the AU as a whole. Further independence. We think that right now, largely Western nations, but nations around the world are seeing somewhat of an authoritarian rise. Somaliland, being a democratic country and being a growing democratic country, is honestly kind of an exception. We most governments are being ousted right now. There isn't really major parties in any democratic country that is seeing gains, and Somaliland had that same thing. Their old administration is out. The new one is in. They're still a democracy, but we think that the link could be that there's a recognition, means that it legitimizes democratic movements. Somaliland voted for governments that are in essence democratic, and we think that AU recognition legitimizes that push for democracy. The Somaliland being a democratic country in a region of authoritarianships means it's an exception. And so the AU recognizing it legitimizes democratic movements. And it says your work towards becoming a democracy is something we believe is both just and preferred. And so ultimately, it helps legitimize this Taiwan's movement towards democracy and Ukraine's movements towards democracy. And it gives these nations legal routes to do so. And it helps determine that right for self determination, in which nations can be able to determine what route their future they want and be able to identify how they can do so. By recognizing Somaliland, the AU has the chance to say, we will legitimize your ability to break free and we will reward you for being democratic, but we will also reward you for being a nation that determined your own future. We think that that inspires Taiwan to say that we want our own future. It helps Ukraine say that we don't want a Russian future, we want our own, and also inspire other movements in the AU towards self-determination. We think that this helps, given Somaliland is a democratic framework, we think that this can help turn authoritarianism and push for more democratic governments around the world. But also it helps maximize human rights and responsibilities, as we think that people have a right towards self-determination and have the responsibilities that come with holding their own governments. So we think when it comes to justice, any one of these points makes sense in terms of there has been wrongs in the past that has harmed Somaliland or the region as a whole. There's been colonization. There's been a lack of democracy being preserved. There's been numerous human rights violations, and there has been a lack of independence around the world. And we think that the AU has the chance to say that these have been wrongs, and we will attempt to make it right by recognizing the country that has attempted to change all of this. And when it does so, it legitimizes those attempts to become democratic, to restore human rights, to end colonization, and to increase the right to self-determination that other countries propose. And so I think justice in this round is also a good both framework and an attempt to route to go towards. A lot of this is a principled argumentation, but a lot of it you can find just good stats and ideas to go for. I can help you with cards if you need. Economy. This is your more standard type cases. On economic development, we think Somaliland is really attempting to grow. We think that it has a lot of chance to grow and become a large, stable economic power in the region that could honestly rival like Ethiopia and Egypt. But we think it lacks the ability to maximize this and attempt to actually reach it because of its international isolation. Additionally, we think because it's internationally isolated, that it's not likely to achieve that. Because it's not seen on the world stage, we think that honestly, a lot of the poverty that is happening in the country will remain. And we think that the government doesn't have the funds to be able to help the people the most. We think that loans from the International Monetary Fund can't get to Somaliland because Somalia controls it. There has been a number of cases where we've seen that countries want to send aid to Somaliland, or not necessarily countries, but organizations as well want to send aid to the region. But because Somalia is the legitimate government, as seen on the world stage, it goes to them instead, and it doesn't reach the people where it's needed. And so we think recognition legitimizes foreign investment into Somaliland, and those aids are more likely to reach Somaliland. We think that when countries see Somaliland as legitimate, they're more likely to send Somaliland's governments that money to be able to aid the people and be able to help them achieve financial prosperity, which we think gives higher quality of life for citizens in the region. We can essentially also see this impact out to where if Somaliland becomes a stable economic powerhouse in the region, both from its port and from its getting the loans, then we see it being able to help be a mediator in conflict because it has financial backing to do so. We think that ultimately economic development can be a priority for the AU, and its recognition helps promote prosperity for the member states as a whole. Forcing Somalia growth. We think that Somalia, having an unstable government, has kind of put it on the downtrend for a number of different reasons. A large part of it is because the government took away domestic interests and put them towards Somaliland. The government spent too much time and interests in what was happening in Somaliland and international scrutiny to really care about what's happening at home. We also think that they're too worried about the issues and no, they're not worried, sorry. They're stuck because they don't have solutions for the terror groups in their region. They're also stuck because the government is inefficient and the government isn't able to do anything about it because it's largely failing. They also don't have the financial backing to do so because they're also somewhat of an isolated state, a bit less than Somaliland. But essentially, on all fronts, the Somalia government can't solve their issues because they care too much about getting Somaliland back, and for a number of different reasons. We think that recognition forces Somalia to back off of Somaliland and stop attempting to get it back and address those internal issues. Specifically, we believe that they likely would attempt to solve those issues because it attempts to prevent more breakaway states. Somaliland getting away is bad for Somalia, but losing Somaliland and Puntland would be even worse. And so we think Somalia would attempt to start to become a better government, and attempt to not become balkanized. We think that this leads to greater governance and attempts to encourage stability for the country, as turning away from international affairs and towards domestic interest would likely help the country and the region as a whole counter both terror and help build a stable actor in the region. We can see this as being a double proxy and how Somaliland would grow and Somalia would grow as well, and both actors get better in the end. International cooperation. We think that Somaliland is different from Somalia because of its democratic outcomes and priorities. Obviously, Somaliland is different from Somalia, and so we think that ultimately these actors are different in a number of ways. And the way that we perceive it actually changes how the resolution goes. We think that the ultimate goal right now for the AU could honestly be economic growth through international priorities because that gets the region the most funds and then gets the most stability in the end. We additionally understand that there is likely a link between getting treaties um, being limited without recognition, and treaties are in some cases needed for cooperation and growth. Somaliland getting relations with Ethiopia and getting that chance for building the port is a large exception. but there needs to be more of that happening. And without it, the nations won't really grow as needed. Recognition gives global interest in the region, which will likely push for those powers, such as the United States and China, to want to influence the region monetarily. I think that ultimately that pushes money to be sent to the region, and that leads to the same impacts as the last two, that leads to the same impacts as the last two contentions. We see higher quality of life, and we see the ability for those countries to actually have the necessity to be able to help their region and help themselves. Spurring American follow-on. This one's a bit of a joke contention because I thought it'd be really funny. But is legitimate. Right now, China doesn't really like Somaliland because its relationship with Taiwan, two democratic breakaway states, is worse than one, and so China doesn't really like Somaliland. If recognition does happen, it's reasonable to say that China will attempt to reinforce its allies in the region to kind of be a check back to Somaliland's democratic growth. We also think that slightly because of Trump, but also because of the United States as a whole attempting to be a democratic outpusher, that the United States would follow suit and back Somaliland and to back other countries in that region, even the ones that China might send money to. And so we think that there's a great chance that those countries would play both sides of the U.S. China relationship and take advantage of both superpowers because both of them would be sending money to the region and all the actors within the region would see growth at the expense of the two superpowers. This leads to the high economic input that's kind of needed for high quality of life, and both superpowers can kind of get played, and the countries in the region have a large availability to grow on their own, because these two superpowers are so obsessed with trying to outrace each other. It is a large funny contention, but it is something that can possibly be true. War. We think that preventing conflict ultimately is additionally another AU agenda or principle that they want to uphold. But there's a number of different ways that they can go about it. Counterterrorism right now is really hard. Somaliland is more capable of fighting terrorists and terror groups than the largest regional power, Ethiopia, because there's a lot less domestic turmoil. Somalia has been able to because it's largely failing government. Ethiopia has been able to because of too much internal stuff. Somaliland is an exception in the region because it has not been as affected by terror and civil war as the other actors. And so we think that recognition could likely lead to global partnership to help fight terrorism. We could see recognition by the AU spurring on the United States recognition, which would encourage building bases in the region to help fight those terror groups, or even just have Somaliland be propped up in order to be a strong democratic force in the region to help fight those terror groups. We think that the outcome could likely be regional stability, especially for Somalia and Ethiopia. All actors get benefited in the end, and we see some war be limited in any sense. Any limiting of war is a limiting of death, and it's a pretty strong principle to go with of limiting death and violence. Preventing war. We think that Somaliland and Somalia are pretty close to conflicts at any given moment, largely because of the One Somalia policy. Additionally, because Somalia has some backing both internationally and domestically. Recognition would likely push Somalia to have to back off because now that Somaliland has international actors starting to step in on its side and send money and send aid, they can actually fight back. It's no longer kicking someone when they're down if that person is now stood up again. Somalia has to somewhat stop threatening Somaliland because it can't reasonably fight a Somaliland that has both backing and actual money to do so. So we think that because Somalia gets to back off, that both countries avoid war, and then this prevents humanitarian crisis. And then you can turn back to the financial economy points in that Somalia has to turn back domestically and help its own nation. Regional influence. The Horn of Africa is reasonably unstable because of both terror and colonial pasts. Um, it largely is going unresolved because there isn't international recognition of the crises, not the international recognition of Somaliland, but because of no one really cares what's going on. Like the United States doesn't really care, and the world doesn't really care. The AU slightly cares, but it needs more attention. Additionally, there needs to be a calm actor in the region that can kind of be a mediator between these actors of both the terror actors and the countries. Largely because the AU has failed to do so. The AU simply just doesn't have enough authority to be and closeness to be able to solve these things. And so we think that Somaliland recognition largely means that there's a larger likelihood that there's going to be a stable actor getting propped up in the region, which would, in most cases, decrease tensions. When there's a stable body to go to for negotiation and mediation, like what Turkey's doing right now with the Somaliland Somalia conflict, then we think that decreases tensions and has a larger availability to end conflict in a conclusive manner without violence. This prevents escalation with the Ethiopia-Egypt conflict because we see the Somaliland's being somewhat of a neutral, being a slight neutral actor, more in favor of Ethiopia, but also because they're a voice in the region that actually gets to be heard, and that's something that matters. That also helps limit terror groups in the region because a stable actor helps with aid, who can likely help Ethiopia and Somalia be able to fight those groups. The second decolonization point is a very high principled idea in that a lot of this violence that's going on of the terror groups in the Civil War is directly tied to Western imperialism, of Western countries starting this cycle of violence that didn't end when they left, because in many cases they either didn't leave in the first place, their influence stayed, or the trauma was too deep and it couldn't end to begin with. We think that ultimately the region needs to reduce its historic ties to colonization in order to escape this cycle of violence. In that, because of the colonial past that happened, that the only way forward is for Africa as a whole and for the AU as an organization and for Somaliland as a country to choose its own future that is not that colonial past. Recognition means that pushing away from colonial past and towards African self-determination, Somaliland leaving the slightly still colonial Somalia, and even in the 1960s breaking away from British occupation, validating that sets the precedent that the AU is no longer willing to accept colonial pasts and is more willing to push for that self-determination in the future of the continent. And it validates other movements that attempt to do so. We think that this gives the best and meaningful path towards Africa and the continent as a whole. The AU is an organization, the Horn of Africa is a region, and Somaliland as the country to reduce its ties to those historical traumas and be able to move towards a future where the region is less decolonized because it has legitimized the independence movements which attempt to break away from those colonial powers and pasts and have that self-determination. Ultimately, that escapes the cycles of violence because those actors are no longer trapped in colonial ideas of the world and can choose their future, ones that, given Somaliland's framework as a democratic country, would maximize human rights and prevent conflict. We think that when it comes to war, that in any instance you have a strong claim to say that you can prevent that the AU has a chance to prevent and minimize conflict, which is an action it needs to take 9 times out of 10, because the future of the continent is largely still stuck because actors are unable to change because they don't have monetary help or because principles are still stuck in the past. The AU has a chance to either give that monetary backing to go towards the future or to give the principle change to also move there. On the neg, that was a lot of principled arguments coming out of me, and this has been about an hour-long lecture already, so we'll try and move pretty quick. On the con, you get three main ideas. You have international influence, you have domestic interest, and then you have another conflict point. All of these could be summed up under both justice, under both econ, and under war. I gave them different names because I want you to attempt to adjust the framework to your choice. On international influence, we think that it's pretty reasonable to say that angering China is not in the interest of the AU right now. Specifically, Somaliland is connected to Taiwan at the moment. You can't really jeopardize China's relationship in the region and to the AU right now because the AU is pretty reliant on China for both economy and security. Recognition makes China kind of mad by legitimizing Taiwanese independence and that push for democracy. And so China has a pretty reasonable understanding that we believe that the AU will likely be harmed by this, and that China can start proxy wars by defending Somalia and giving them aid and pushing them to attack Somaliland, also by pulling funding from the region as a whole, which would reverse growth trends. We think that ultimately there's a large claim to say that China would likely step in, not to overturn the recognition, but make the future after recognition pretty bad. Predatory lending, the lack of not the lack of independence, but the lack of independence and recognition that Somaliland has, or it's not the lack of independence. I just wrote that wrong. The lack of recognition means that there's no loans for Somaliland. Like the IMF is not sending them to Somaliland. That's been pre-established in the AF slides. But the loan system from the IMF not getting to Somaliland is honestly a good thing because it's a predatory system because it specifically targets high interest rates and forces economic policy changes for the countries that get those loans. It's also just asking really high economic demands that they know the countries won't pay back because they likely can't. And so it puts them into really bad standings. Recognition means Somaliland will almost certainly start to take those loans from the organizations. If you find someone going against you saying, "What if Somaliland just doesn't take it?" We think that most odds, 9 times out of 10, it likely will. The former president and the new president has expressed interest in those loans. Um, what this does is it disrupts Somaliland economic policy and enables bad debt practices, likely pushing the country towards debt. The United States can afford having debt because it's with our own US dollar. Other countries can't because they have to pay us back in our own money, and they simply, in most cases, can't really do that. So what it does means that Somaliland is less reliant to their own economic cycles. It is more reliant to the global ones and bad economic prioritization, which means we'll likely lose that growth that it's been seeing lately, and would then be on set to have economic backsliding and potentially democratic backsliding. There's a link between economy and democracy there. So we think that this idea is that the AU also endorses those bad monetary lending parts, and if you want to make it a principled case, you can say that the AU's recognition encourages more doubling down of those bad policies. So the IMF could honestly be worse because they're being endorsed in some instances by the AU. Rewarding bad behavior, Somaliland is really democratic in some instances. And it's an exception in the region, but right now they're facing democratic backsliding, which is where their democracy is starting to falter, and they're also committing a few human rights violations. We also think that the new government right now needs to get it together and be able to figure out what went wrong in order to keep the democracy going. And so that recognition means that the AU kind of sends the message that the things that happened of human rights violations and that democratic backsliding are now going to be rewarded. Instead of doing it 10 years ago when it didn't necessarily happen, we're going to reward you now when you are committing violations. What it likely does is that the AU sends that message that we're going to reward you, and people's moves towards democracy become lessened as it's an endorsement of that violence and of the human rights violations, and encourages less improving of structures. This honestly undermines efforts from the AU to promote democratic outcomes and maximize human rights. We think that it's kind of just a bad timing point, and you can kind of lead this to a number of authoritarian impacts. Further secessions. There's a large amount of independence movements in the AU right now. The AF will say that's good, and honestly, morally, I say that's totally fine. But the current approach from the AU is to respect colonial borders to prevent that chaos and conflict that independence movements and violent revolutions have. What recognition does is it violates all those precedences and encourages the emboldenment of those separatist movements across Africa. But but we don't believe that a lot of them are going to work, and it's somewhat of a domino effect that would ignite violence across the continent, in that pursuit of self-determination. We think that the right to self-determination is good, but that a lot of these movements will fail because they need a lot more ability to grow like Somaliland had. So I think that too much revolution with too little structure would cause widespread instability and failed movements because it completely unstabilizes the region, as a lot more of the actors within the AU see internal turmoil, which prevents the availability of propping up good movements that we want, and means that the region is seeing too many secessions, which would unstable a lot of actors that need to be stable. We can look more towards other democratic countries within the AU that would suffer as a result, and their democracies get harmed. So when it comes to international influences, there's a number of different cases to say that recognition means that it's harder for pre-existing democracies to continue to exist because either China undermines them, they have to upend their economic practices, they get rewarded for being undemocratic, or current democratic nations face regional powers being unstable because of secessions, and their democracies get harmed as a result. Democratic interests. There's technically a critique in the New Age colonialism point, which we don't do on the circuit, but I feel like it's still worth introducing to you. The international standard of self-determination is built on a Western view of it. We think that self-determination for the AU and for the world is somewhat Western, and we think that Somaliland's democracy is unique, as it's a slight mix of that Western ideal, but also it's unique, as it still holds a lot of principles to the region. And I'd like you to do your own look on that. I think that lack of recognition actually gives Somaliland the ability to determine its own future and path forward, and not be beholden to those international standards of self-determination, which is under the view of the Western powers who are the colonial powers. Recognition ultimately puts international pressure on Somaliland to conform to the AU and UN protocol, which is very influenced by that Western thinking of the world. This actually, in a lot of senses, violates the right to self determination, as it's a direct inability for Somaliland to attempt to find the future that it wants for itself. Because I think there's a case to be said that even if a country wants to be authoritarian, it shouldn't be authoritarian under the Western view. If a country wants to be a theocracy, but not under the Western view. And if it wants to be a democracy, thank goodness, but it doesn't have to be in the Western view. This is a critique of how we understand the idea of self determination, and we think that ultimately, you as the neg can say whatever claim to self determination the AF is attempting to run is a false understanding, and recognition gives a false narratives of self determination. We actually set false precedents that can cascade to a number of different impacts. If you want to talk about those impacts, we can set up a meeting on it. Enabling corruption. There is enough will to say that the Somaliland government being only really given money internally because of taxes is pretty good because it encourages reinvestments towards people, and specifically gives encouragements towards reinvesting into infrastructure, which best maximizes the quality of life. I think that recognition changes that monetary source either from those predatory loans or just like a nation sending money. And so what it does is that changes the prioritization from domestic to foreign, or from the people to the government, which encourages outward investment rather than domestic. Instead of spending money on roads and help and improving hospitals, the government would likely either help themselves or become more internationally active, which would take away from its people, which is critically needed right now for the success of the democracy. We think that this leads to the government ignoring the citizenship, which lowers the quality of life in the region and actually prevents Somaliland from growing to the best of its ability. You can do the impacts from there. Threatening the seaport negotiation. I think this is one of the better domestic interests ideas. Right now, Ethiopia and Somaliland are likely to finish their seaport agreement, which would be the single most likely attempt to stabilize the region, and would likely give Somaliland a better clear route for recognition from other nations. We think that the AU recognizing Somaliland is has potential to give them a best route towards being seen on the global stage, but we also think that that countries giving recognition is honestly more powerful because then it's better a chance for relationships to form among countries. When Ethiopia and Somaliland work together on the seaport exchange, they're more likely to have stronger ties than all countries having general ties to Somaliland. I think that's a better route or as actually being seen as a legitimate country. So what recognition does is it honestly jeopardizes the agreement that Somaliland has because it's put under different pressures by Somalia and China. Ethiopia doesn't necessarily want to be have their seaport negotiation threatened because Somalia is more likely to attack and China is more likely to undermine it and even blockade the region. Recognition leads to the destroying of these negotiations because Ethiopia becomes scared of the neighboring actors. Because Somalia will get China backing. China might honestly just do something, or Egypt becomes more threatened at a rising Ethiopian power, especially when Ethiopia controls the source of the Nile. We could likely see Somaliland not being able to go through with this seaport negotiation because Ethiopia would back out. What this means is uncertainty leads to more isolation instead of actually getting recognition. Of getting good recognition, Somaliland would get false recognition and would actually still be isolated on the world stage and lose out on key trade opportunities which it needs for growth. Ultimately, Somaliland gets hurt in the end. Democratic uncertainty. Right now, the president has been in for less than 2 months. And there needs time for the democracy to breathe. It's like if the US um, got into a war 2 days after Biden got into office. Biden would need time if he wasn't VP before to understand what all actions are best to take, and we think that it takes a lot more time than just recognition happening like that. So ultimately, the government needs a lot of breathing room to allow for the best practices and to minimize the human rights violations that happened in the previous regime. Sudden change in this international relations puts the governments in large, difficult positions and largely means that it isn't likely to be able to make best choices. And recognition puts too much pressure on that new government. And both with pressures from authoritarian states like China, we don't think that they're necessarily going to choose the best democratic outcomes because they're under too many international pressures to do so. Somaliland being an isolated democracy means that they have the chance for that self-determination and towards a true democratic path, and all of these actors in the region being able to now influence them because of AU recognition puts a lot of pressures on them to do certain things, which would likely be undemocratic. Conflict. Um, there's four left, and then we'll have a final thoughts. Egypt Ethiopia conflict. The Gerd Dam is causing a lot of tensions between Ethiopia and Egypt. Right now is a really tough time for the two because they're honestly really scared of each other, both of them. Recognition would undermine Egypt's influence over the region because it would largely empower Somaliland Ethiopian relationships. In some senses, this is kind of a contradictory point to the ports one from two ago, but it would likely encourage Egypt to be influenced to spark fear-based preemptive attacks to protect the Nile and protect their water supply. War between the two powers would honestly destroy the whole region because they are the two likely strongest and powerful in the region. And the impacts can go from there, either climate damage to strong regions. Or cascading effects as US and China get in closer to nuclear war, you can determine the impacts, but ultimately it's that these two regional powers are in such a tough time right now that you as a judge should not be willing to vote AF because we don't want to have the chance for war between them. Territorial disputes. Right now, Somaliland's borders aren't necessarily defined. They're pretty tough to determine because they're kind of fighting with Puntland right now over what borders actually are. They haven't reached an agreement because it's kind of hard to do so because both sides want everything. They're both semi-autonomous, and because they can't really agree, they're kind of at a standstill right now. Turkey is attempting to negotiate both borders and Somaliland freedom, And so it's kind of an interesting point right now. Further, right now, we think that recognition at this specific moment would embolden militaristic force on either side to shape their border. Because if Somaliland has backing, then they're more likely to exert their force and attempt to get the borders that they want. We also think that, um, additionally, Puntland and Somaliland would also be willing to fight back more because they're going to have like China backing them, or because they're going to be emboldened to push for the one Somalia policy after recognition. And so I think that ultimately we see these two sides going to clash over this border, which would likely lead to proxy wars and more violence, and would take away attempts to reduce terror in the region and solve the instability that countries are facing. Masking colonial influences is another pretty principled case. I think this is the fourth and final decolonization point that we've written up. But essentially, it's starting with a recognition that ending decolonization will never have an endpoint because it ultimately is going to take a long time to ever truly understand what exactly happened and to really gauge what the colonial scars will look like and really to understand that it's never actually going to heal. The AU and Somaliland have made great efforts to rid the continent of that colonial past. Somaliland better than the AAU because the AAU is attempting to uphold like the colonial borders, but stability's sake. We think that recognition gives the false premise that decolonization has an endpoint or that it's over. By recognizing Somaliland, we think that the AU, in some instances, in saying this is the final endpoint of decolonization, and that there's an attempt and that it's a large principle to say that this point of democracy that's facing backsliding, this point of a country that has territorial border disputes because of colonial pasts, that this point of time that this country is needing help and is unable to really achieve the future success is a key point of ending colonization, and that this is where we stand on it. When in reality, the AU doesn't really have the authority on it to say when decolonization is over, or even if there is an endpoint to exist, but it recognized that all harmful actions will continue because it masks exactly what colonialism effects had on the region. And it honestly masks movements like Afrofuturism and other ones that help push for unity among the countries, because now you have dissolution in the AU on what exactly the future of the continent looks like because of the differing view on colonialism. Further conflicts never find solvency as terror groups get get legitimized as the AU endorses the region and some senses as a whole. Ultimately, what this does is that it avoids finding solutions to the roots of African issues and gives a false route of Pan-Africanism and African identities. And the point essentially says that recognition of Somaliland at a bad point in time because the democracy is slightly weakening because it's financially kind of in a bad spot and that it's struggling to make ends meet both socially, economically, and politically, that this is our endorsement, when in reality, it needs to come later when Somaliland is at the best possible point. And you can combine it with like the predatory loans to say that independence is the best route to do so. Destroying Somalia is the last point we're going to talk about. Right now, Somalia is struggling to survive the war and terrorism. We don't necessarily see them being able to solve these things unless there is strong intervention or unless they are likely to um, prioritize different things. But we think that right now the government's honestly starting to get better to work at this, and they have a small chance of fixing these things. But all six Somalia states, or at least all the states in the region, are considering secession and are on the verge of war. Recognition would validate Somaliland leaving, which would validate Puntland that call for autonomy, and all those states call for autonomy as well. It would likely destroy Somalia as an entire country, which would embolden all of those states to follow through on its secession and essentially balkanize the region because those states are, in some instances, at conflict with each other. This leads to region-wide instability and more violence as all of these new states enter the region, attempt to find their identity and how are in conflicts with one another. So that covers it really for the end of of the case cover of the cases. Finding them was the fun part. There are a few final thoughts before we end this hour plus lecture. Ultimately, you need to tell your judges that they should adopt the perspective of the AU and not the US. Ultimately, saying like things that are in the interest of the United States, other than like maybe democracy, but you can critique that. Um, don't have a place in the round. This is one of the first resolutions we've seen in a long time where the actor is not the US or the actor is just not the globe, it's the AU. And so the interests of this resolution are is going to be in the continent and be in the AU as an organization, and it should honestly stay that way for the best possible rounds. Secondly, I think a focus on turns and offense is your strongest point for this. This being a policy resolution gives you the most route toward this. We think that most of the arguments are going to be probably really similar. You can probably see how I used the same impacts for majority of the cases I gave. A lot of it is just the question of the link. Turning the link would honestly be a largest play to do in most rounds. Lastly, avoid racism. It should go without saying, but we are somewhat of a Republican lay circuit, and so the likelihood that there's going to be cases that exist under Western ideas, or there's going to be cases that exist that are inherently like biased against the region as a whole, because of either race, ethnicity, or religion, is a non-zero chance. And so all of you should consider your own internal biases and consider how exactly the round should be shaped, under the framework of this being the AU and a continent that we've hardly really studied as a debate group, and be able to determine what a round should look like because this isn't the US, and keep your own biases at check and be able to look at what exactly the world should look like given this. All that said, this is all I really have for the lecture. It's a bit long compared to other ones. I'm not really Jet Smith. I like to talk. But I will have the link for the slideshow in the description. And I will see the rest of you at tournaments. We have two main ones and then a few online scrimmages left before state. And then from there, the season's about over. So until then, take care.